The call from the cosmos. In the silence of space, Saturn hung like a ghostly lantern, majestic, distant, and eternal. For centuries, its golden rings had captured the curiosity of skywatchers, poets, and scientists alike. But no one expected that the planet still held a secret, hidden just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. It began not with a bang, but with a flicker. Dr. Ilara Voss sat hunched over her terminal in a quiet observatory on Mauna Kea. Outside, the Hawaiian night was ink-black, pierced only by starlight. Inside, a new dataset blinked on her screen, stacked images taken over several weeks by telescopes tracking Saturn's orbit. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But Ilara had spent her career studying the outer planets. She knew how to look beyond the obvious. There, just at the edge of Saturn's gravitational halo, small, dim blips shimmered in and out of the image frames. Most would dismiss them as camera noise or cosmic dust. But Ilara's instincts whispered something else. These weren't artifacts. They were moving, purposeful, rhythmic. She called in her assistant, then another. Soon, whispers in the observatory turned to gasps. They were moons. Dozens of them. Within days, teams across the world confirmed the finding. 128 previously unknown moons had been discovered orbiting Saturn. It wasn't just a record breaker, it was a paradigm shift. The planet already held the crown for most moons in the solar system, but this new discovery catapulted that number into the unimaginable. Over 250 natural satellites now danced in Saturn's domain. Yet, beneath the excitement, a quiet question emerged. How did we miss them all this time? That was the real conflict. Not between nations, or between scientists competing for glory, but between humanity's pride and the cosmos' quiet refusal to be tamed. With all our satellites, supercomputers, and deep space missions, we had still failed to see what had been circling Saturn all along. The universe had whispered, and we had been too loud to hear it. These moons weren't large or bright. Most were irregularly shaped, no bigger than mountain ranges. But their orbits were ancient, their existence unquestionable. And if they had eluded us this long, what else might be hiding, lurking in the shadows of the planets, dancing behind rings and radiation belts? Ilara stood alone in the observatory, staring at Saturn's live feed. She thought of Galileo, whose telescope first turned toward that planet 4 centuries ago. He had seen something strange, something he couldn't name. Now, centuries later, another mystery had arrived. Unexpected, quiet, yet undeniable. The stars had spoken again. But this time, they hadn't offered answers. Only more questions. And in that silence, the story truly began. The moons with no names. Numbers were easy. Names were hard. When the discovery of 128 new moons around Saturn was confirmed, headlines roared. Scientists published papers, space agencies issued press releases, and Saturn, already majestic, seemed to grow larger in the collective human imagination. But as the data piled in, a strange silence settled in the astronomy community. No one knew what to call them. The International Astronomical Union, the authority responsible for naming celestial bodies, was overwhelmed. These weren't just dots in the sky. They were bodies with stories, each following erratic, often chaotic paths around a gas giant that refused to be simple. Some looped backwards, retrograde, in defiance of planetary order. Others tilted like broken compass needles, carving out orbits at impossible angles. Clusters of them moved in groups, like ancient tribes migrating across invisible trails. Dr. Ilara Voss stared at the orbital simulations. It was as though Saturn had gathered these moons not through birth, but through collection, stealing space rocks, captured asteroids, maybe even debris from past collisions. Their randomness was unsettling. They weren't siblings born of the same disk of gas and dust. They were orphans. Still, she couldn't stop watching them. The software gave them sterile designations: S/2023-S45, S/2023-S98, strings of slashes and digits that erased their mystery. But Ilara knew better. These weren't just statistics. These were the missing pieces of a story Saturn had been whispering for eons. And no one was listening closely enough. In meetings, her colleagues debated priority. Which moons to analyze first, which paths to model, which names to propose. Mythology, numbers, indigenous lore. The Norse group of moons already had titles: Skati, Surtur, Grape, but 128 newcomers would flood the system. Naming them all felt impossible, even absurd. But the conflict ran deeper than nomenclature. It was a battle between wonder and bureaucracy, between the poetry of the skies and the limitations of human categorization. One evening, Ilara walked alone through the observatory's dome, the quiet amplifying her thoughts. She paused beneath the main telescope. Outside, Saturn was invisible to the naked eye, just another point in the darkness. And yet, above that darkness, a secret crowd of moons moved silently, each one real, cold, ancient. She imagined them not as dead rocks, but as messengers. Survivors. Some might have been torn from other planets. Others, shattered remains of long-forgotten collisions. And now, they circled a world too far for us to touch, but not too far to feel. They were unnamed, yes, but not unseen. And for Ilara, that was enough, for now. She returned to her station and opened a new file, Moons, Unnamed. She smiled faintly, typing the first line. Sometimes, the cosmos doesn't give answers. It gives mysteries. And we are meant to listen. Saturn, the Moon King. The numbers didn't lie. Saturn now had more moons than any other planet in the solar system, over 250 in total. It wasn't just a scientific milestone. It was a throne reclaimed. For decades, Saturn and Jupiter had danced in a quiet rivalry. The gas giants, titans of mass and magnetism, took turns in the spotlight. Jupiter, the ancient king, had long held the crown with its 92 known moons. But now, with the discovery of the hidden 128, Saturn had pulled ahead decisively. It was no longer a question of scale. It was a statement of supremacy. Dr. Ilara Voss leaned back in her chair, the glow of orbital maps painting her face in shifting blue. Moon King, she whispered aloud, not as a joke, but as a title earned. She wasn't interested in planetary politics or pride. But this moment, felt monumental. Still, beyond the headlines and glory, a deeper conflict stirred. Why does Saturn have so many moons? The question haunted her. The newly discovered satellites were too numerous, too irregular, to be easily explained. Some orbits were so eccentric they defied long-term stability. It was as if Saturn's gravitational field had become a cosmic net, catching whatever wandered too close. Scientists posited theories, many plausible, none proven. Perhaps Saturn had once had fewer moons, and a massive collision shattered one into dozens. Or maybe, over billions of years, it had stolen space rocks from the Kuiper Belt or beyond, pulling them into reluctant orbit. Each possibility led to another question. Ilara turned to Cassini's data, still preserved from the spacecraft's fiery plunge into Saturn's atmosphere years ago. Though Cassini had never seen these particular moons, it had hinted at the planet's complex past. Ripple patterns in the rings. Anomalous gaps. Tiny disturbances that made no sense, until now. The moons explained everything. Or rather, complicated everything. The mystery wasn't just about how many moons Saturn had, it was about what those moons meant. They were records. Fossils. Time capsules from a chaotic era when planets warred for mass, and gravity was the only law. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. What else is waiting to be found? If Saturn could hide 128 moons in plain sight, what else had the solar system tucked away? Could Uranus or Neptune harbor their own hidden entourages? Were we truly explorers, or just blind visitors to a backyard we thought we knew? Ilara shut down the simulations and walked to the telescope dome. The sky outside was cloudless. Infinite. Cold. She didn't feel victory. She felt small. Saturn had spoken. Not in thunder or flame, but in silence, with a crown of ice and shadows. And as she gazed up at that distant world, now surrounded by more companions than ever imagined, she realized the story was no longer about what had been discovered. It was about what might be next. Echoes beyond the rings. The more they found, the less they seemed to know. With Saturn crowned as the Moon King, and 128 new satellites now charted in cold orbit, the scientific world buzzed with theories. Some hailed it as the most significant planetary discovery in decades. Others viewed it as a riddle with no clear solution. But for Dr. Ilara Voss, the conflict was more personal. What does it mean to be surrounded by so much, yet still know so little? The moons had mass, motion, and measurable paths. But they lacked narrative. Their silence was deafening. They didn't speak of life or destruction or purpose. They simply were. And that was both comforting and terrifying. Ilara remembered her childhood, lying on a rooftop in a quiet town, tracing constellations with her finger. Back then, space had felt like a promise, a vast frontier waiting to be explored. Now, decades later, with more knowledge than ever, it felt heavier. As if every answer carried 10 new questions. As if discovery itself had become a kind of burden. And yet, there was wonder. The newfound moons had already shifted models of planetary formation. Theories of orbital stability, gravitational resonance, and celestial migration were being rewritten. If Saturn could harbor so many unseen companions, what of the outer giants? What secrets did Neptune guard? What ghosts circled the edge of our system, beyond Pluto's lonely path? This was no longer about Saturn. It was about everything. And yet, for all the science, it was a human story too. Our tools had grown sharper. Our eyes could pierce deeper into the void. But we were still driven by the same ancient longing, to name, to map, to understand. These tiny moons, invisible to the unaided eye, now pulled at something intimate within the species that discovered them. A need to belong. Because in finding them, we were reminded, we are not the center of the cosmos. We are a footnote in a story far older and vaster than we can comprehend. A species of skygazers, scribbling notes in the margins of a celestial manuscript we cannot yet read. Ilara sat once more at her console. The data flickered softly, like stars refusing sleep. Outside, Saturn spun silently in the void, its new moons locked in their strange, ancient waltz. She typed one last line into her personal log. The universe is not done speaking. We must learn how to listen again. And in that quiet moment, between what had been revealed and what still waited, she smiled. The mystery was intact. The journey was far from over. The cosmos had whispered, and Earth had finally whispered back.